Okay, so this is our Simondon reading group. We're continuing our reading of Imagination and Invention, picking up from page 56 of the translation. So we're in part one. We're at section C, the beginning of section C within part one. So what we looked at last time was these sort of intermediate forms of images. So we had a couple weeks ago we looked at these images that are formed through fear, and so he talked about phobias, and there was the example of these medieval legends or folk stories about toads, spitting venom and so on. And then we also looked at sort of the opposite, so the images that have to do with hope, and so in particular hope of being reunited with our loved ones after death, and the sort of images of resurrection that are associated with that hope. And then there are these sort of intermediate images, and so he points out that these sort of the two instances of fear and hope are sort of extreme cases, and in general, our relation to images is one that's a sort of mixture of the two, or a combination of the two. So we have some idea of what a future event might be, and we have a sort of mixture of fear and hope. Fear that it might go badly, hope that it will go well, and in general, these images that have a sort of mixed origin, or that involve both fear and hope, have this sort of intermediate reality. So the way Simondon describes it is they have they're neither transcendent like the fear images, nor imminent to the subject like the hope images, but they sort of at a middle distance, in the same way that a rainbow is always just in front of the horizon, no matter how far you go forward. And so these sort of intermediate distance, he gives a few examples of what these kind of intermediate distance images consist in, or would be like. So he talks about celebrity culture. So things like actors and actresses, and he especially emphasizes the princesses as like this sort of fantasy image of a world that is connected to our world of everyday life, but also sort of separate or distinct from our everyday life. So these are people who are supposed to have some sort of superior value, or some sort of priority over the rest of us, even though they live in our worlds. They have to eat and drink and so on like the rest of us, but they have this sort of fantastical nature, or this sort of legendary quality about them that the rest of us don't have. And then and then sort of developing further that kind of legendary side of things, he looks at folk tales, and the kinds of sort of transformations that occur in these folk tales. So you have like the story with the toad that can turn back into a prince, or you have Sleeping Beauty who can be reawakened by the prince's ardent desire, and then there's also again in sort of folk tales we have the Cinderella story, where the servant girl, who is sort of despised and no one really cares about, takes on the value, or can turn into the princess, and then the slipper is sort of the symbol of her capacity for metamorphosis and transformation. So and then again, Simondon is using a symbol here in his specific sense that we talked about last time. So it's a sort of complementary reality. So it's one piece that fits with another, and they together form a whole. And then the last set of examples that Simondon looked at of this intermediate reality had to do with amateurism, or sort of do-it-yourself culture. And so he talked about how in the sort of DIY world, there are these ideas of kind of infinite possibility or limitless capacity for transformation, or the idea that you can start with anything you can imagine, and then you can create it using the set of tools and materials that you have. And so he talks about how the equipment that is marketed to DIY people often is marketed as specifically having this kind of flexibility that you can use it on any kind of material, you can use any kind of power source, etc. Um, and he points out that this sometimes is not even really a functional flexibility. Like the tool itself is not as effective as a more specialized tool would be, but it's this sort of affective value of flexibility that is marketed to the DIY enthusiast. And so, yeah, so these objects that the DIY person uses have this sort of reality as a kind of virtuality. Their value consists in the possibility of always being transformed, or fitting into any situation, as opposed to like a sort of set of properties that they would actually have. It's instead what they could be that is sort of valuable about them. Okay, so that's what we saw last time, and so this time we're going to go on to the third phase of the first level of the general cycle of the image. So we're looking at the anticipatory role of the image in reflexive thought, essentially. If I can get a volunteer to read the first, let's read the full subsection 1 up to the section break there.
I can read. See, intuition is pure a priori image, principle of reflected knowledge. Subsection 1, the projection schema in Platonism, the role of intuition. The intuition of amplificatory projection from current potentialities may serve as basis for a reflective operation, whereby the subject is installed in the unicity of the source movement in order to intuitively accompany the differentiation in the multiple and in the successive becoming of this intention or initial force. Such a vision is at least partially initiatory or mystical, even if it uses the power of conceptual structures as a relay. As a principle of philosophical thought, the a priori image is the idea rather than the concept. It is even more purely unconditional and more thoroughly unique than ideas. Ideas, which are multiple in a certain aspect, play a role in amplificatory projection, which is not that of the source of the projection. Behind ideas as primordial origin of projection, there exists, beyond essence and existence, the one source of all projections, analogous to the sun, which, in the sensible world, lights up objects, allowing them to bear a shadow, which amplifies them, multiplies them, but also degrades them. In the Platonic doctrine, the excellence and superiority of the good with respect to becoming in the multiple cannot be understood without an essential postulate. The good is the source of intelligibility and participation in the intelligible world. It is the sun of the intelligible world. It lights up archetype ideas. Existence is a direct projection of essences in the intelligible world, a demiurge for the passage of the intelligible into the sensible. Knowledge retraces the steps followed by projection or demiurgic imitation. This is what provides the full meaning of the myth of the cave. From the shadows and reflections of the world of Genesis and Thora, which is to say, from the most multiplied and inconsistent images of projection, it is possible to behold the models themselves and the source of projection, granted one turnaround forcefully. This method of conversion, used analogically in the paradigm of the sensible, also applies to the path of knowledge in the intelligible world, where it allows one to reach through successive stages of purification and initiation, the end of a dialectic in the antechamber of the good. Knowledge moves upstream from this projection through successive degrees, which gives sensorially perceptible existence. It may seem paradoxical to consider the Platonic theory of participation as expressing a primordial image of pure movement, since it presents itself foremost as an example of a contemplative theory. However, we must grasp this theory of knowledge from the purview of an experience of progressive degradation of an original model through the more or less distant and various images that may represent that model, becoming more indistinct the more distant they are from the primordial reality, like copies of copies or reflections of reflections. In shadow projection, thaumaturgy, the shadow becomes larger the more distant it is from the model casting the shadow. The model casting the shadow, but it also becomes fuzzier because projection from a light source proceeds according to the principle of proportional triangles. The ancients did not know optical systems allowing the production of punctuality, nor did they know that a light source small enough to be treated as a geometrical point, which would have rendered sharpness independently of the magnifying relation. The relation of model to copy is the basis of participation. Should I finish this section?
Yeah, maybe actually we can stop here. Yeah, it's a bit longer than I thought. Yeah, let's stop here because this is a little bit dense for those who may not be familiar with Plato's theory of the good. But yeah, so this is drawing from the Republic. There's the famous passage where the doctrine of the forms is outlined, and then there's this idea that so the forms are of course we have forms of a human being, I don't know, any sort of object. There's a form that corresponds to the essence of that object. But then Plato, or in the guise of Socrates, argues that there's this principle of the good, which is above the forms or above the ideas, and the good is comparable to the sun in the physical world, and the sort of generation of physical objects, or objects that have physical existence from the ideas, is comparable to the way that a shadow is projected by a light source, whether it's the sun or a lantern or something. So there's the famous cave analogy where the shapes are, so you have a light source and then some shapes, and then you have some people chained to the wall that are facing another wall where the light is projected, and the shadows of the shapes are projected onto the wall. And so here the light source is the equivalent, or the representative of the good, this principle of the good, and then the shapes are the correspondence of the essences, or the ideas or the forms, and then the shadows projected onto the wall are the equivalent here of the physical objects. So the sort of theory of the creation, or the genesis of these physical objects, is that the idea of the good sort of projects through the ideas, and then the physical objects are these sort of copies or shadows of the ideas. So they have a lesser degree of reality than the ideas. And so this is why the realm of the physical is a realm of becoming and never of being. So physical entities are always arising and passing away, and are not, they never are fully what they are. So there's nothing sort of perfectly exemplifies the form of a human being, but there's always becoming and passing away. And so this is the sort of general picture of the doctrine of the forms and the good that is outlined in the Republic. And what Simondon is arguing here is that we have to understand this doctrine as having to do with a motor image. And the idea is that, and we'll see a little bit more as we continue in this section, but the idea is that to understand this sort of schema of thought that Plato is outlining, we have to place ourselves in the position of the light source of the sun, or the principle of the good, and then we sort of imagine ourselves proceeding outwards from that source. And so the passage from the source of light past the shapes onto the shadows projected on the wall is a kind of process of degradation of reality. So it's a constant. Each sort of step of the progression is at a lower degree of reality than the preceding one, and so Simondon points out that this is maybe somewhat paradoxical for someone who is acquainted with Plato and the idea that our knowledge is always knowledge of what is and not of what becomes. And so Plato is always contrasting the forms as these perfect, eternal, immutable realities with the realm of coming to be and passing away. And so it's a sort of paradox to treat this doctrine of the forms as having to do with motion. But then, so Simondon argues that our sort of grasp of this picture involves this motor image, even though the content of the doctrine has to do with the immutable forms and the eternal reality of the good and so on. Our grasp of this doctrine is through this motor image of situating ourselves in the position of the principle of the good and then proceeding outwards. So it's a bit of a reinterpretation. I mean, it's fairly traditional in some senses, but also it sort of concretizes the interpretation of Plato here, in that we actually have to sort of create an image of what it would be to situate yourself in this doctrine, and so to come up with a sort of imagistic account of the understanding of this doctrine.
He uses the terms procession and conversion in this section, which are terms that he also used in the history of the notion of the individual in volume 2 of Individuation. And I went back and looked at some of my notes, and it seems like the first use of those terms in volume 2 was in relation to, in a discussion of the Western Christian heresies. And I think the idea of procession is that there's this continuous process of degradation where true concentration or true creation is sort of concentrated at like the origin of the process. And then in conversion he initially associated with like individual salvation as opposed to through the mediation of the community. But it seems like in volume 2, procession is associated with an isolation of the individual, I think just because the individual is never at the origin as a created individual, whereas conversion allows for a kind of direct connection between the individual and the source of creation.
Yeah, thanks for going back to individuation and bringing that back in. And I think here the distinction between procession and conversion, I think we can think of it in terms of whether the relationship to the original principle, whatever exactly a particular system takes to be the sort of originating principle, is what the question is whether the relation to that original principle is continuous or discontinuous. I think is sort of the fundamental difference between procession and conversion as he outlines it in Individuation Volume 2. So in procession, we have some sort of the sort of ontological schema that we work with is that there's some sort of fundamental principle, whether it's the good or the one or whatever other principle we want to start with. And then there's a sort of continuous descent of a hierarchy of degrees of reality from that original principle. So the original principle has like the sort of maximum degree of reality, and then there's a continuous descent of degrees of reality from there. And then the sort of consequence of this doctrine is that we as individual philosophers have the capacity to sort of reascend that hierarchy of degrees of being. And so this is a sort of contemplative doctrine where, and it's a kind of elitist doctrine in the sense that the philosophers are the elite who are capable of reascending towards the original principle, though they can never sort of fully attain that complete return to the original principle, but they can ascend the hierarchy of degrees of being and get closer and closer to the original principle. Whereas the rest of humanity is sort of stuck at whatever level that they find themselves at. And then the conversion idea is that there's a sort of discontinuity of or there's the capacity for a kind of jump in the scale of being. So you and again in relation to Christian doctrine, there's the idea that you can undergo the process of conversion, and you sort of go from a state of damnation to a state of salvation, and not by sort of passing through all the intermediate degrees, but through a sort of jump to a higher level of reality. And this doctrine tends to be a doctrine of conversion. I don't know if it's sort of a necessary consequence, but it tends to be a sort of universalist doctrine. So anyone can go from a state of damnation to a state of salvation by repenting and accepting the true faith and so on. You can no matter what state you're in, no matter how low your degree of reality is, you can always undergo this conversion and find yourself in a higher state of ontological validity or consistency or whatever. And so as opposed to the sort of elitist doctrine of the procession tradition, we instead have a sort of universalist doctrine in the conversion tradition. And this often also, so in addition to sort of being universalist at the individual level, so every individual can convert, it also often has to do with a sort of communal inheritance, so that the process of conversion is a process, or the event of conversion is an event of sort of joining to an existing community, so a church or something similar, and it's this sort of union with the community or joining the community that allows you to achieve salvation and redeem your low ontological state. And so Simondo outlines these two sort of opposite or contrary traditions of thought, or these two schemas of thought that sort of interact in the late antiquity world. So here, in relation to Plato, the Platonic doctrine is actually he sort of gives us both sides in different places. Again, in Plato, it's always difficult to say what exactly is Plato's doctrine and whether it changes, and whether what Socrates says is sort of a representation of Plato's actual doctrine and so on. But in different places, we have a sort of idea that there's a kind of ascetic ascent towards the forms and the principle of the good. So we sort of gradually purify ourselves to sort of return to this level of knowledge of the forms. And then there's also more like a conversion doctrine, where we have a sort of sudden transformation, where we turn away from the realm of becoming, and we turn our attention instead towards the forms and the principle of the good. So like in the cave story, the prisoner sort of breaks the chains and then turns around and contemplates the forms and the principle of the good, instead of looking at the shadows on the wall. So there's a kind of discontinuity. It's not just a continual progression towards purification. So Plato gives us both sort of stories, and how exactly they fit together is probably a difficult question of Plato interpretation that we don't really need to get into. But so there are these two sort of accounts of the relationship between the individual and the sort of central principle of being. and both of them are at work in different aspects or different parts of Plato's doctrine. Okay, so let's go on to the rest of this subsection. So I think we are at the bottom of page 57, the relation of model to copy. If someone would like to pick up from there.
I can read it if nobody's in.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
The relation of model to copy is the basis of participation. This relation is akin to that of being to becoming, of the one to the multiple, and finally of essence to existence within the sensible. The sensible, the indistinct, and the multiple are on the side of the copy, while the model possesses the unity of uniqueness and the perfection of intelligible essence. The passage from the perfect, intelligible essence to existence through generation and corruption is analogous, as demiurgic copy, to the projection that degrades and distances. The philosophical dialectic, which leads back up to the intelligible, allows one to become a spectator of the demiurgy that projects existences. Instead of staying between the thaumaturgis and the screen, eyes turned towards the wall where the shadows are cast. It places us between the light source and the stage, where the thaumaturgis brandish the silhouettes that cast the shadows. Philosophical knowledge is a gaze that accompanies the projection in the process of making itself, and the demiurgy in the process of occurring, by no longer staying among the copies and existences in becoming, but very close to the source itself, whence come light rays in their unity. Philosophical contemplation is not a participation in the demiurgic activity. It is the intuition of the movement of the rays being projected. It thereby installs the mind, l'esprit, as it is said of the good, beyond essence and existence, that is to say, at the source, well before the cast shadows, existences, and before even the models, essences. In Illuminism, the contemplative gaze goes in the direction of the light rays projecting existence. The subject of the gaze coincides with the unity of which they emanate. The highest philosophical initiation is thus not only a knowledge of the models, ideas, but a mode of being that makes the philosopher coincide with the absolute source of forms and existences. It is indeed the intuition of anticipation in a pure state that is sought in this turn back towards the most unconditional principle, the most complete and radical a priori, the most anterior to any mode of being. It is not movement, but the intuition of all projections towards existence and the multiple.
Right, so this is what I was talking about earlier. So to grasp this doctrine of the forms and to sort of understand how the forms are generated, we sort of imagine ourselves into the position of the principle of the good, and then we imagine the movement outwards, past the shapes that constitute the forms, and then we project onto the wall. So we go from the principle of the good to the forms to the entities in the world of becoming that reflect the forms or that are copies of the forms. So we have this sort of motor schema, this sort of abstract idea, this abstract image of movement that we use to grasp this doctrine of how the realities in the realm of becoming arise from the ideas by means of this principle of the good. And here, talking about the procession and conversion sort of dichotomy, so Simondon is emphasizing here the conversion side. So the prisoner has to turn around. There's this sort of discontinuity between the sort of the realm of opinion, where we make correct statements or incorrect statements about the shadows on the wall. There's this realm of opinion, and then we have to sort of tear ourselves away from this realm of opinion and turn around and face the projection, the light source projecting outwards. We have to sort of face the forms and disconnect ourselves from the realm of opinion, the realm of becoming, and turn towards the realm of true eternal being. So Simondon is emphasizing the discontinuous aspect, but then the other side is that in Plato we always have this doctrine of a kind of practice of the dialectic, so that Socrates is always going around asking people questions, and as he puts it, he's trying to learn from others, but in the process, he generally shows that they actually don't know what they claim to know. Um, but there's this constant practice of dialectic and this constant sort of purification of the soul. We are never sort of fully. It's not just the case of sort of undergoing a conversion once and for all, but it's a case of constantly purifying your soul and sort of separating yourself gradually and through constant discipline from the realm of opinion and becoming. The other side of the doctrine is there in Plato as well, even though Simondon here is emphasizing the sort of conversion aspect.
So my question is like a Platonic idea of the good. As far as I understand, that the idea of good is actually indicates a perfect and eternal and permanent kind of unchange of some kind of idea, right? And then it's kind of like a top-down approach about the being, as far as I understand. And then Simondon actually is against like Plato, right? And then what he tries to explain here is kind of if he accepts Platonic idea, to what extent, then the multiple copies can be understood as kind of conversion, the form of a conversion, like something like that. By doing that, he can give some kind of singularity to the so-called multiple copies, right? So my first question is the basic position of Simondon. He's against the Plato, right?
I don't think he's so much against Plato's doctrine here, but he wants to sort of grasp what is the image governing Plato's doctrine. So the idea here as a sort of strategy of interpretation is to take what Plato describes in a sort of mythical form, this myth of the cave, and sort of grasp what is the image structure of this myth. So what sort of if we sort of strip away the contingent aspects, the fact that it's a cave and so on, and sort of grasp the core of this story, what kind of images are at work in this story, and Simondon's argument here, or what he says that we can grasp as the core of this story, is precisely this motor image of starting from the position of the good and proceeding outwards. So what Simondon is doing here is not so much sort of arguing for or against Plato's doctrine, is instead trying to give an account of it in terms of the image and where it fits into the cycle of the image. So he's essentially saying that Plato has grasped one piece of that cycle of the image, this sort of reflective phase of the anticipatory level. So if we remember that cycle of the phases and levels, so this is the third phase of the first level, the third level of the first phase. I mixed those up, but yeah, it's the anticipatory phase of the reflective level. So it's when we sort of think about what we're doing when we anticipate in our imagery. So that's sort of what Simondon was doing here, as opposed to like arguing for or against Plato's doctrine.
Probably I have never thought of like the part like the origin of all the beings, like how Simondon conceived that part. But according to this part, in a way, like he seems to agree that there could be some kind of original form, like it is called here that the good form, the good. So like the other copies like derived from the original form. At least Simondon accepts then the idea. Is it?
So I don't know if he wants to accept this idea as sort of his own idea, but he wants to he wants to take what Plato's story depicts and show like what aspect of reality is it that Plato is grasping through this story. So he takes it that Plato, is not sort of completely wrong. He's not just making things up. He did sort of grasp something about the way that reality works in general. But we want to sort of figure out which aspect in particular that story grasps and how that aspect fits with other aspects of reality. So this is what the whole cycle of the image is supposed to do. Is supposed to allow us to situate these different aspects of reality in relation to each other.
And I think this becomes more clear with the next two sections, where he moves through Plotinus and Bergson, where he basically develops a continuity between Plato, Plotinus, and Bergson in their conceptions of intuition and the role that it plays in philosophy, and basically tries to find a thread between those that is useful for his project.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, so he's sort of identifying this sort of hidden unity. Just as a sort of surface level history of philosophy, you wouldn't take Bergson and Plato to be sort of representatives of something the same. Bergson is all about movement and duration, and then Plato is known as the theorist of the immutable eternal forms. So they seem to be sort of contrary to each other. But Simondon identifies this sort of shared image, or this shared motor image element that is sort of continuous from Plato down to Bergson. So you have this sort of hidden continuity in the history of philosophy. And so he wants to grasp, situate this, aspect of reality that is being grasped in this tradition in relation to other aspects of reality that are grasped by other philosophical traditions. And we'll see that throughout the rest of the lectures. But I think, the project is like, if we start from the assumption that Plato, was grasping something true, or there's something true about the story of the cave. There's a real aspect of the world or of existence that he's grasping. We want to understand what exactly it is, how we can express the content of that story, and then situate that story in relation to other stories that might seem to be contradictory or different than that story, and see how they all sort of fit together.
Thanks.
Okay, so let's go on to let's read. Maybe we'll just read subsection 2, because again, this is somewhat dense. So it's just one paragraph. If I can get a volunteer to read that one for us.
Let me read.
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
To procession conversion, the second path is possible in the use of the intuition of anticipation, that which Plotinus uses to write towards the one, superior to all hypothesis. Contemplation is prepared by exercises, reading texts, conversation, but it is conducted in reflection and silence. After contemplation, which is like an ecstasy, the mind, l'esprit, expresses what it has seen in words and discourse. Plotinus compares contemplation to the moment when geometers, after having thought, can see, and after seeing, they write and trace the figure of the solution. In other words, revelatory contemplation is the starting point of speech, of explanation, and the gesture of communication. Knowledge is a conversion that leads to the point where one can seize the procession that organizes existences from the one. In this doctrine, too, intuition provides knowledge because it is effectuated at the end of an ascent that allows an absolute anticipation to be recovered and the world to be grasped as a procession in a state that is complete a priori in relation to any deployment of sensorial experience in temporary existence.
Right. So here, Simondon is applying the same kind of strategy to Plotinus as he did to Plato. And Plotinus, of course, is a Neoplatonist from, I think, the 3rd century AD, something like that. But yeah, so he's writing several centuries after Plato, but he's trying to he takes it that he's sort of reviving the Platonic doctrine, and yeah, so he tries to like systematize Plato's doctrine, but in doing so he sort of transforms it as well. And in Plotinus, there's this idea of contemplation as the goal of knowledge. So we are sort of and not just of knowledge but of life in general. So we're always sort of oriented towards trying to contemplate the good. And so again, there's this procession and conversion side, sort of duality that Simondon talked about. And for Plotinus, it's the procession side that dominates. So we are always trying to reascend that hierarchy of being. So everything is sort of generated out of the principle of the good. And yeah, and then everything, and then our sort of goal in life is to reascend that hierarchy, and get that vision of the good as much as possible. Yeah, and so again, there's a sort of contrast with Plato because it's no longer a kind of sort of turning around moment and this sort of immediate transformation. It's instead this kind of ascent towards the good. But then we also have these sort of moments, and I think Porphyry says that Plotinus had like 3 instances in his life where he had this sort of perfect contemplation of the good. So yeah, you have these sort of moments of perfect unity with the principle of the good, and but they're very rare. Even someone who is sort of devoted to contemplating the good only has a few occasions in their life where they achieve this perfect unity. Yeah, so a similar type of image, sort of processed, but now with a different emphasis in Plotinus as opposed to Plato.
Did Plotinus, I don't know very much about him. Was he talking about meditation, or was it some kind of intellectual, mystical union with the good?
Yeah, it's not entirely clear, I think, what exactly this practice consists in. Like he does talk about, so there's of course sort of intellectual arguments. You have to read Plato's texts and discuss what it means and argue against, like there's a Plotinus text against Gnosticism, for example. So he's against the doctrine that the world is created by an evil demiurge. So you have to argue against false doctrines and so on. So there's a sort of rational intellectual side. But then at the same time, this sort of perfect unity with the good is something that is beyond sort of purely intellectual, or yeah. So the level of the intellect is the level of the forms. But then you have to ascend beyond the level of the intellect and the forms to the level of the union with the good. So that's sort of higher than the level of the intellect, and yeah. So it's not again it's a sort of mystical rationalism, I guess. Like you have this realm of intellectual knowledge, but then you have to ascend beyond that to achieve this kind of mystical union with the good. And like any mystical doctrine, it's hard to explain exactly what this union consists in. But yeah, so it's sort of a combination of the sort of rational argument level and then ascending beyond that level to this union with the good. Yeah, and for those who are maybe listening after and are not here in the session live, we're in the chat. There's an ongoing discussion about some of the connections with Buddhist doctrine. So this idea of, especially in Zen Buddhism, this idea of sudden enlightenment and how that connects with this idea of conversion, and the idea that there's this Buddha nature in everything that has to sort of be. And again, I don't know this very well, so maybe someone else can correct me here. But the idea is sort of that you have to release or allow the Buddha nature to manifest itself, as opposed to sort of achieving enlightenment. It's already there. You have to just sort of allow it to manifest itself, as opposed to being sort of hidden the way it is now.
There's a long history of, I guess, what's the word, theological dispute over Buddha nature and enlightenment. The major division you see is in the Zen or Chan tradition between what's called the Northern School and the Southern School. And the Northern School sort of believed in gradual enlightenment, whereas the Southern School believed in sudden enlightenment. But even sort of the Southern School's sudden enlightenment was accompanied by an idea of cultivation, where the sort of work that one does isn't necessarily progressing enlightenment in any way, but sort of fertilizing the ground from which sudden enlightenment may spring.
Right. Yeah. So I think that fits. I mean, again, not something I know very well, but I think that fits with this idea that procession and conversion are these sort of dual or two sides of the same coin, that they sort of fit together in some sense. So, like in Plato, we have both aspects. We have the conversion and the procession aspect at the same time, and different emphases in different dialogues or different parts of a dialogue. So yeah, I think it makes sense to see both the gradual sort of this idea that you sort of gradually have to work, or this sort of constant progression on the one hand, and the idea that there's a sudden transformation, that they probably both sort of fit together, or that any individual doctrine is probably likely to have both aspects, even if it emphasizes one over the other.
Yeah, now that I think of it, the Southern School, Sudden Enlightenment school of Chan Buddhism kind of sounds like Stoicism, in the sense that achieving wisdom in Stoicism is this sort of threshold effect where it's all or nothing, rather than a gradual perfection. You can be one degree away from achieving wisdom in Stoicism and still be just as unwise as somebody who's never worked towards it at all, at least in my understanding.
Yeah, I think in Logic of Sense, Deleuze illuminates some parallels between Stoicism and Zen Buddhism.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. He talks about the role of the koan as kind of similar to some of the logical paradoxes in certain ways that the Stoics looked at. And so this doctrine of the sort of threshold effect of wisdom is something that Simon Rowe talked about in that history of the notion of the individual text. So there's the idea that wisdom in the Stoic sense is a kind of resonance with the rest of the world, or harmony with the rest of the world. So you have to everything has a certain sort of ratio, and then you have to sort of find the right ratio where you fit in with everything else. And so again, like in harmony, there's no such thing, or there's not really such a thing as like approximate harmony. Like you're either in tune or you're not in tune. Even if you're like slightly out of tune, you're still out of tune. So this sort of resonance effect is a kind of threshold. So you have to actually meet that exact sort of quality of harmony with the world to sort of be to count as being a wise or a sage. So it's an all or nothing effect, as opposed to like sort of gradually ascending in wisdom or gradually purifying your soul or something along those lines. You either achieve that harmony with the world or you don't. I think again we can think of this in terms of this duality that Simondon outlines between procession and conversion.
In Buddhism, like the ultimate goal to get to the nirvana, the state of nirvana, is that kind of more like a let it go? I mean, kind of liberation from the old kind of sufferings. Uh, I understood the nirvana that way. Then is that kind of opposite kind of way of being? Like think about Plato, like every being should make an effort to reach the state of the good, but it's kind of like a bound to that kind of ultimate, how to say, being, the original being. But in the case of Buddhism, I think that's kind of like a convert. I mean, the opposite kind of direction. Am I wrong?
Yeah, maybe Ben or Angus, you both have more knowledge of Buddhism than I do. Maybe you can answer this as well. But I think I think it probably depends on the different Buddhist schools or traditions, like what relationship we might want to see them having to Platonism or to Plato's doctrine. Um, but I think this sort of gradual procession versus sudden conversion duality, and the way they interact with each other, is something that we can probably identify in different doctrines, so that even if there are obviously, of course, even if we want to compare Stoicism and Zen or other sort of parallels that we see between Buddhism and Greek philosophy. Of course, we're not saying that they sort of agree on everything, but we, at least in the sense of this duality of gradual procession and sudden conversion, we can sort of identify the same structure, even if the doctrines in other respects might be different. So yeah, I think that's what I would want to say without sort of venturing too much into Buddhist interpretation that I don't know a lot about.
The only thing would like to briefly add is like about the origin, like, of being. So actually, like a sudden enlightenment or gradual enlightenment, that's the way of meditation. If we put it apart, put it aside, the Buddha, like maybe like thinks of the world as nothing. Like it's like a kind of bottom up, like a science like approach. Maybe like as Lu, right? Am I wrong? Anyhow, like previously, like mentioned, and Bergson part, the next part would explain more. But what I think is like a Plato and then Plotinus, both are focused on at the birth of the world or universe. There is an absolute being, like alien, like something perfect was there, but the Buddha or other kind of philosopher would think a different way, like there's some kind of nothing, not even absolute being, something like that. So we should go back to the nothing. That's kind of the idea of nirvana, something like that. So going back to our textbook, what I really am wondering is that why Plato like set up some kind of the idea of the kind of so-called absolute being, or the good, or the idea, something like that. That's kind of really interesting part.
Yeah, and I think it again has to do with sort of different, I guess, intuitions or different starting points, right? Like a different, intellectual system starts from a different, I guess, intuition. So there might be sort of shared images that reoccur in different intellectual systems, like in certain schools of Buddhism and certain schools of Greek philosophy. There might be sort of shared images or shared image schemas, even if the sort of overall starting point is very different. Like, yeah, as you pointed out, so in Plato, we have this idea of like this sort of absolute reality, the realm of, well, we have the realm of the ideas, and then the good, which is beyond being. Yeah, so and this is sort of opposite, or in some sense at least appears to be opposite to some of the Buddhist doctrines about emptiness of things and so on. But yeah, so there's maybe different directions or different starting points, even if we can also see some shared images. So I think searching for these shared images doesn't mean that the intellectual systems as a whole are the same. There can be very different intellectual systems, even if there's like one sort of shared structure of imagery that they both use.
I think in Difference and Repetition, Deleuze points out that at the base of Platonism, there is a moral desire to distinguish between the true and the false, right? The real distinction that Plato is after is the distinction between the... Sorry, I'm not sure what the proper English translations are, but like the true images and the simulacra, right? And the whole theory of the ideas that are illuminated by the good is a tool to facilitate that distinction, which is ultimately a moral approach.
Yeah, and I think so. In that text, Deleuze emphasizes the sort of dichotomy method that Plato uses. So in the Sophist in particular, he gives us these, I think they're meant to be somewhat comical, but these sort of genealogies of the Sophists. So the Sophist is a kind of hunter that hunts rich young men, as opposed to a hunter who hunts land animal, deer or whatever. So there's like, and then he gives different genealogies or different sort of ways of dividing. So you always start with one concept and you divide it into two, and the entity that you're seeking, the sophist, will be in one of those two halves, and then you divide that half in two, and you keep dividing until you find the right definition. But and then of course the whole sort of problem of the sophist is that each time you feel like you have arrived at a definition of the sophist, you realize that the sophist sort of eludes your grasp because there's this role of non-being of the sophist, and then that sort of leads to the whole doctrine of how non-being is in some respect in the sophist. So this sort of Platonic method of dichotomy is always about distinguishing the false pretender, so the sophist in this case, from the true reality, and so this would be the philosopher who sort of actually relates to the forms or has knowledge of the forms and the principle of the good. This sort of moral project of distinguishing the false pretender from the true representative is quite distinct from various Buddhist traditions, like the project in the different Buddhist traditions of achieving release from the cycle of reincarnation, for example, or enlightenment, whatever exactly we take that to mean. So these are different types of projects, and so we can understand why the sort of intellectual system that accompanies these projects would be different. Okay, so let's go on to the Bergson section. Let's read. Yeah, why don't we read the whole thing? It's just over a page. If I can get a volunteer to read that.
I can read. The intuition of the moving and the knowledge of creative evolution. A pure intuition of the moving, the mouvement, according to Bergson, allows us to grasp life in its most profound nature without the obstacle of concepts, which play a pragmatic and utilitarian role, but pluralize and immobilize the real. Logical and conceptual thought corresponds to a knowledge of what is partus in the order of the quantitative and the static. Through a forceful turning back on himself, the philosopher can detach from the habits of language and the mechanized servitude of conceptual thought in order to grasp, through intuition, the qualitative and dynamic continuities of the deeper self, its freedom and unity. In this sense, we find in Bergson a dualist attitude closely reflecting those of Plato and Plotinus. Yet it is not the whole of existence and temporality that are rejected in favor of the unique source known through intuition and participation. The equivalent to participation and procession for Bergson is no longer a degradation, compelling the philosopher to attach himself to the contemplation of unity and its origin. The unity of the primordial upswelling is preserved in the continuity of life's movement that becomes diversified through matter. Matter itself is like a movement that comes undone. The intuition of the moving is no longer constrained by being absorbed in the pure anticipation of the a priori creative gesture. Leaving the source, intuition accompanies the river's coursing, follows evolution in its development, since the élan vital is a perpetual a priori that remains a source throughout existence. Creation is not localized at the origin, it remains present throughout the stages of becoming, for intuition allows us to grasp evolution as creative. Automatisms and kinds of closure are ordered according to this unique movement that deposits them along its course. Instincts and closed societies are like waters that eddy while the rush of the river's waters continues on. The origin is ever present. Movement does not produce distance from the origin. It is never cut off from its past, since there is no degradation. In such a doctrine, intuition is a participation in the creative movement of evolution. Knowledge is rendered possible because the subject is recipient of the élan vital. He finds himself in what exists outside. What is in him is nothing other than the original élan, now running through the subject. Like a single sentence begun long ago, which, always interrupted by new additions, still remains the same in its lasting duration. At whatever stage of its development, movement is always inchoate. We could say that movement is a perpetual origin that is prolonged, a permanent anticipation of itself. Similarly, the image, in this case, is not a simple metaphor, nor is intuition purely subjective. As the subject discovers the way in which he participates, he prolongs and continues his participation. He continues evolution, anticipates. Teilhard de Chardin added to the individual or personal dimension of this participation in a creative becoming that of the collective. Since he considers the goal of personal flourishing to be an arbitrary limit reflecting a certain aspect of civilization. The philosophical doctrines of intuition differ over time if we take into account normative ideals. That of Plato proposes stable structures in relation to which amplificatory projections' only role is to multiply and cause to exist. That of Plotinus is an invitation to ecstasy in the mystical seizure of the one via the principle of procession. Conversion is not necessarily followed by a fallback to temporal existence, as in Plato, who wants the philosopher to be the magistrate of a city with fixed laws, images of numbers. In contrast, Bergson and even more so Teilhard de Chardin take intuition as the starting point for a real participation in the becoming of life through humanity. And yet, the primordial character of the motor content of any a priori image of anticipation, in spite of the fixity of the archetypes, was already latent in Plato. Philosophy is also the knowledge of mixed things, of the indefinite diet, of the Genesis Eis Usian, sorry for my pronunciation of what I assume is not French. According to the philosophical metretique, that's probably Greek, right? Of number ideas. Hence, this philosophical doctrine, replete with a priori images, was able to become quite naturally the inspiration for the highest school of political philosophy of the ancient world and the model for the most audacious reformers. A priori images are fecund, even and especially when they are reinserted in the world as long-term anticipations after the long road. Ten Makran Odon of philosophical thought.
Right. Yeah. So those are Greek, little bits of Greek quotes from Plato. So the first one here, Genesis eis ousian, means I guess genesis of the essences or of substances. And then ten makran hodon is the long road. Yeah, it says that in the text. The long road or the long detour, I guess. So here we have a sort of the third instance of the motor image as a philosophical schema of thought, and so here Bergson is maybe this is like the easier one to see the role of this image, as opposed to like in Plato, this imagery, this motor image is maybe harder to grasp, whereas in Bergson, of course, his whole philosophy is all about movement, so we can and the sort of inner intuition of movement. So it's easier to see this role of the image in Bergson's philosophy than it is in Plato. But yeah, and so it's a somewhat different use of this image, because so we still have this kind of duality between two aspects. We have the sort of inner reality of duration, and then the sort of outer reality of matter in space, the world of extension. But they sort of interact in a way that is different than in Plato, because we have the role of the élan vital in bringing about evolution of living beings. So life as a sort of inner process brings about the transformation of entities into sort of realization of greater and greater realization of this capacity for sort of autonomous movement, and yeah, so there's this even within the realm of the living, there's this kind of duality between automatism and instinct on the one hand, and then intelligence on the other hand, so yeah, we have this sort of openness in human beings, this capacity to sort of situate ourselves in the movement of life. And then we have in insects, I think is Bergson's example, insects have this sort of automaticity. They follow these sort of fixed patterns of behavior. Yeah, and so these are sort of like the two divergent sides of the living being in relation to this push, this current that is life. Yeah, and then the last paragraph here is just sort of a summary of the whole section, and it has to do with the relation between this motor image and reality outside of the image, I guess, or outside of the like we have this anticipatory motor image in Plato and all these other doctrines, and then the question is like, what sort of effect does this have on the rest of the world? And so for Plato, it has to do with the formation of the city. So we have in the Republic still we have this doctrine of the famous doctrine of the ideal city, which has the certain it has the philosopher kings and the ratio of the different elements of the city to each other. Each aspect of the city corresponds to an element of the soul, and so on. So the idea is a kind of fixed structure. The goal of the city is to generate a kind of structure that would not destroy itself in the way that Plato thinks that democracy in Athens is kind of destroying itself. And whereas for Bergson, the idea is not so much, or is kind of opposite, in the sense that we are not trying to produce a fixed reality that would remain stable. We're trying to bring about this sort of openness of society, and he contrasts the closed societies and open societies, and he thinks that the open societies sort of are open to this sort of inner movement of life in a way that closed societies are not. Although, of course, every society has a certain aspect of closedness and a certain element of openness at the same time. But yeah, so what Simondon is emphasizing here is that these images, even though they're very abstract, they are used to bring about transformations of reality. So this anticipatory image brings about changes of the world, as well as just being a sort of intellectual construction.
Definitely, this part's like so to the out my questions is magnificent. I think because I now realize that like how like some of those ideas like connected to the Plato, because Bergson creative evolution, like that's the book like Alain Vital first came out, and this idea in a way like also connected to the potential like Simondon's individual theory like potential whatever. So yeah, this is this part is like quite good for me.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of. I mean, Simondon doesn't talk about Bergson that much, but he definitely is very influenced by this whole doctrine of intuition and this sort of inner movement. But I think he wants to. Whereas for Bergson, we have this kind of duality of the inner intuition of movement and then the sort of outer reality that is static. I think for Simondon, he wants to sort of account for this duality as opposed to sort of presupposing it in the way that he takes Bergson to do. So he wants to like show how these two sides themselves arise out of something that it would be neither inner nor outer. And again, that's very abstract, but like this is sort of Simondon's general intellectual strategy is whenever there's a sort of conceptual opposition, you try to find a sort of point out of which the two sides of the opposition will arise through some sort of genetic process. So I think he wants to do that same kind of move on this duality that he finds in Bergson. So this whole theory of the image is kind of related to that move, I think.
I think so. I think I read this whole thing like I'm coming from Bergson, so that's the lens I'm reading this whole thing through. And I do think that there is like a case to be made that you can read basically this whole book, at least what I've read of it up to now, as an adaptation of the theory of images that Bergson brings in meta and memory, where the problem that he tries to resolve is actually in the end like the problem that you just described, that in the essay in Time and Free Will, he kind of has this strict opposition between an inner duration and the static outside. And he introduces this theory of images and then goes to the whole thing about contractions that Deleuze loves so much, to kind of resolve that. And I kind of lost my track where I was going with this because I had a point, but now I don't.
Yeah, no, that's good though. Bergson is definitely very subtle. So I think I oversimplified when I gave that sort of opposition between Simondon and Bergson. And I think Simondon he's definitely sympathetic to a lot of Bergson's ideas, and he I think sees himself as sort of continuing what Bergson was doing, but in a sort of different set of materials. Drawing from Bergson's sort of reference point in general is like he often operates on, or creative evolution in particular is a drawing on biological reference points, and that's sort of I think maybe the field that he felt most sort of attracted to or drawn to. Where Simondon is taking a physical, like an image or an analogy drawn from the world of physics, the crystallization example, and then sort of amplifying that into other realms of thought. But with a similar, I think, goal as in Bergson. sort of grasping the development, grasping entities in their becoming, as opposed to grasping them as a sort of static reality that's already given, and then accounting for the this duality between the becoming and the static itself in terms of becoming.
Yeah, I think what this book is really doing vis-a-vis the Bergson books is like it does situate the theory of images well within like the behavioral science of Simondon's time, because there are some problems with the science that Bergson draws on. Like that's just like how it goes, right? In 50 years difference. And I think my earlier point was actually to say that this method of trying to find a point from which you can differentiate into the opposites or antagonisms that arise at first is actually kind of where Simondon and Bergson are the closest to each other, because that's where that's kind of the trajectory of Bergson's work as well. He starts with an analysis that finds a few oppositions, and the larger project becomes always more to find points which allow an account of those oppositions that grasps them as a process of differentiation.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it would be interesting to sort of go back to Bergson and like with Simondon in mind, and sort of see how closely this method sort of maps onto some of the some of Bergson's books. I think maybe Creative Evolution might be one of the sort of prime examples of this, where he has that sort of duality between instinct and intelligence as and then sort of tries to account for how they differentiate from each other, or sort of differentiate from like the starting point. And yeah, and then I guess the two sources of morality and religion would also be another instance of this. Yeah, the sort of open and closed aspects or sides of societies. Again, as sort of differentiating out of a starting point. So yeah, I think you could definitely do like a sort of I don't know if it's a Simondonian reading of Bergson or a Bergsonian reading of Simondon, but like sort of mapping them onto each other. And that would be an interesting project to take on.
Actually, Bergson might have been influenced by like a Darwinism, like, almost the same, right? Because like the idea remind me of Darwinian evolution, and then as Lou also mentioned, like Bergson's idea definitely like tells like how like a differentiation could be generated from the that's kind of important different point of the Plato's like the good theory. And then relating to this, in relation to this idea, actually in old times, like for example, there is a philosopher whose name is Democritus, who argued the atomic theory, more scientific, like in terms of modern science idea existed at that time. But I'm also wondering how and why like Plato's the good theory, some kind of absolute being, dominated like a philosophy at that time. Then Democritus or more kind of modern scientific ideas. But at the end of the day, like Simondon is like more kind of like leaning to the much more scientific idea, as far as I think. That's what I think.
Yeah, the relationship between Bergson and Darwinism is kind of an interesting and difficult one. Maybe Lou probably could comment more on this, but yeah, so he has an evolutionary doctrine, but it's not a Darwinian evolution. But I think he wants to sort of see the Darwinian mechanisms of evolution as being sort of one aspect of evolution, but not as sort of exhausting the reality of evolution. And then it's also interesting that you bring up Democritus, because he has this atomistic doctrine, but he also, in the ancient atomists, so we see in Lucretius, for example, a sort of quasi-evolutionary doctrine as well, where we have this idea that organisms sort of formed out of like combinations of different organs that sort of, some of them form like these monsters that have like 3 heads or something that didn't survive, and then the ones that have sort of harmonious, well-organized bodies are the ones that did survive. So it's a obviously with very different sort of intellectual tools, but it's a sort of analogous to Darwinian arguments around how evolution, the sort of mechanism of evolution, works through allowing certain organisms to survive and reproduce, and then others that don't survive will disappear. So yeah, I think that it's a complicated topic with a lot of different elements that we probably can't really get into too much here, but it's a good question to bring up. Yeah, and Lou pointed out in the chat here that that Bergson's sort of opponent that he's targeting in creative evolution is primarily the sort of Spencer tradition, Herbert Spencer, which what exactly the relationship is between Spencer and Darwin is also a complicated question, because some of Spencer's works, I think, predate the origin of species. If I'm not mistaken, the phrase survival of the fittest is also from Spencer as opposed to Darwin. But there's also a lot of differences between Darwinian and sort of Spencerian evolution in terms of like the mechanisms of how evolution is supposed to happen and so on. It's a fairly complicated topic that I'm sure someone has done a PhD thesis on. Okay, so we're just about at time, and we're at a section break, or a break between 2 parts, actually. So I suggest that we stop here. As a reminder, I'm going to be away for the next 2 weeks, so we're going to take a break until hopefully the 30th, April 30th. So I should be able to attend the session that week, but if something comes up, I'll post in the schedule channel. So if you have like questions about things that we've read together over the last couple of weeks, you can always put them in the channel on Discord here. And so I'll I'm traveling, but I still have my laptop, so I can try to answer those questions. And it also might be a good opportunity to look at some other Simondon texts like Individuation and On the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects, and try to make connections with what we've been reading and see how they fit with those texts as well. So so I encourage everyone to stay active in the Simondon channel on here, and if you have questions or comments or whatever, feel free to add them over the next couple weeks.
Okay, that's a good idea. Thank you so much.
Okay, so thanks everyone, and I'll see you in approximately 2 weeks.